That was so interesting. Trust with verification because of those bastards. Paul, it's the shoes. You wouldn't trust anybody with those shoes, right? Is that what you were getting at? When I was in graduate school the first time, I was in a master's program in experimental psychology at Cal State Fullerton, and I was in a behavior lab, a Skinnerian lab, a lab with rats that press bars and pigeons that peck keys, and humans that press bars. And then after I left that to do bike racing stuff, I kind of lost track of what happened to the behaviorists movement and behaviorism and so forth. And so we've done a number of pieces over the years in Skeptic, and so I thought when sort of on evolutionary psych and behaviorism and whatnot, I thought if we're going to study this problem from all these different aspects that we've been covering from all angles today, I thought we should have a behavioral aspect, a Skinnerian behaviorist, and Hank Schlinger is that man. He is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Cal State University, Northridge. He received his PhD in psychology from Western Michigan University, where he also completed a postdoc in behavioral pharmacology. He's authored 3 books: Psychology, A Behavioral Overview, A Behavior Analytic View of Child Development, and Introduction to Scientific Psychology. That you shouldn't have to use both of those names. They should be just one, but that's part of the problem with psychology, I think. In addition to behavioral pharmacology, he's published research on and basic learning processes in humans and non-humans. And he's done a number of pieces for Skeptic. He's got another one coming out. Actually, it'll be similar to the talk here today, in which he's looking at consciousness from a rather different perspective. With that, Dr. Hank Schlinger.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank Michael for inviting me to participate in this conference. I also want to thank Paul for confirming something that I've known for a long time, that I am an alpha male. As Michael indicated, well, I'm not sure he indicated this, but the title of my talk is Consciousness is Nothing But a Word. Before I begin, I'd like to just clarify what we mean by nothing. An indefinite pronoun indicating that there is not anything, not a single thing, or not a single part of a thing, used to indicate the complete lack of the quality mentioned in somebody or something, a zero quantity or zero, and finally a state of non-existence or the absence of any perceptible qualities. Consciousness is nothing but a word. In 1991, Daniel Dennett wrote a book titled Consciousness Explained. 10 years later, in 2001, he penned an article titled, Are We Explaining Consciousness Yet? If he had to ask the question, the answer is obvious. 4 years later, here we are, still trying to explain it. English-speaking philosophers and psychologists have been trying to understand consciousness at least since John Locke introduced the word into the English language in the 17th century. And despite the best efforts of those who've thrown their hats into the ring, we haven't made much progress. Obviously, we need a different approach. For the past decade or so, many have argued that the brain gives rise to consciousness. Some have set their sights on finding its so-called neural correlates, trying to explain consciousness, as the late Sir Francis Crick described it, in terms of the interactions of nerve cells and the molecules associated with them. Referring to consciousness as the major unsolved problem in biology, Crick stated that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. But these things are more than the behavior of your nerve cells, just as a Seurat painting is more than the 1,000 points of paint on the canvas. They're also your behavior and the activity of your peripheral nervous system, all in a rich context. But Crick is obviously not alone in believing that reductionism will solve the riddle of consciousness. And sexy, sophisticated technologies seem to offer hope for such beliefs. I, for one, am skeptical. And here's why. First, before we search for the neural correlates of consciousness, we need an overarching theory of behavioral causation within which to understand human behavior, including consciousness. Then we need to know what consciousness is and how and why we become conscious. Even then, consciousness will not be found in the brain. No behavior will be. Knowing how the plumbing works, in other words, the proximate neural causes of behavior, is not enough. In the quest to understand consciousness, the work of neuroscientists will indeed be important, but it will only be a piece of the larger scientific puzzle. Neuroreductionism alone is not the answer to the puzzle of consciousness or any behavioral phenomenon. To put it rather bluntly, we can understand consciousness at its most important level without any knowledge of neural correlates. That's not to say that such knowledge won't clarify the brain's role in mediating behaviors that we call consciousness, but the ultimate explanations are to be found in the evolutionary and individual learning histories that shape the actual behaviors that we refer to as consciousness, not in the brain. And those explanations will come from evolutionary biology and learning science. But we won't even get that far as long as we continue to talk about consciousness in such unscientific, metaphorical ways. Consider, for example, the following summary of a recent book on consciousness. And I didn't make this up. Through this analysis, the first and most obvious observation is that consciousness appears as a volumetric spatial void containing colored objects and surfaces. This reveals that the representation in the brain takes the form of an explicit volumetric spatial model of external reality. Therefore, the world we see around us is not the real world itself, but merely a miniature virtual reality replica of that world in an internal representation. Whew. No wonder Daniel Dennett said, with consciousness, we are still in a terrible muddle. Consciousness is not a place or a thing or a mental or cognitive process, whatever those are. It's only a word that we use in a variety of ways. For example, we can say that an organism is conscious if it's awake and or alert versus asleep or in a coma. We can then study the behaviors associated with wakefulness and the underlying neural structures that mediate them. Crick and Koch use consciousness to refer to visual perception, which is an acceptable strategy as long as it points to actual behaviors involved in perceiving and their ultimate evolutionary and learned causes. But most discussions of consciousness are muddled because what people talk about is subjective experience, or so-called qualia, such as the redness of red. But what does that mean, the redness of red? Newborns come equipped with specialized receptors that respond to the wavelength of light corresponding to red, but they don't yet respond differently to red than to other colors, and thus don't experience the redness of red. Humans alone learn the concept of red because we alone learn one response to all things that reflect that particular wavelength, even if they differ in all other respects. That one response is the word red. We're taught to say red by others who reinforce the response only in the presence of red things. Other animals learn to respond to specific red things, such as a red fruit, but only humans respond solely to redness. Physicists can explain the nature of the wavelengths corresponding to red, and neurophysiologists can explain the biochemical changes that occur when those wavelengths strike photoreceptors. But we need behavioral psychologists to tell us how someone learns to perceive and thus be conscious of redness. So to answer the question, what's it like to be a newborn? Nothing. There is no conscious experience. There are no qualia, not yet. Seems like a good place to take a sip of water. Discussions of qualia are muddled because the definition is vague and subjective. Of course, qualia, like consciousness, is just a word. As psychologist Noel Smith has noted, the concept of consciousness is a construct, an invention, an abstraction, a contrivance. But it's an unsatisfactory construct in that it has no specifiable reference. There are no real events that comprise it, and thus no agreement about what it is and how it operates. According to Smith, it's only a tangle of words because it consists of no more than words. Thus, those searching for qualia or consciousness may as well be hunting for Lewis Carroll's snark. So, will we ever be able to solve the problem of consciousness? David Chalmers believes that while the ultimate answer will come from cognitive neuroscience, we're still a long way from that answer. According to Chalmers, consciousness is the biggest mystery. It may be the largest outstanding obstacle in our quest for a scientific understanding of the universe. The science of physics is not yet complete, but it is well understood. The science of biology has removed many ancient mysteries surrounding the nature of life. Even in the science of the mind, much progress has been made. Recent work in cognitive neuroscience is leading us to a better understanding of human behavior and of the processes that drive it. We do not have many detailed theories of cognition, to be sure, but the details cannot be too far off. Consciousness, however, is as perplexing as it ever was. It still seems utterly mysterious that the causation of behavior should be accompanied by a conscious inner life. We do not just lack a detailed theory, we are entirely in the dark about how consciousness fits into the natural order." Unquote. Well, whether or not consciousness is the biggest unsolved mystery in the universe, I don't think a science of the mind has produced much progress towards understanding it. In fact, there can be no science of the mind, because science deals with real observed events, and the mind is not real and can never be observed. That's why there are no detailed theories of cognition. To solve the two problems I've just outlined, the disproportionate emphasis on neuroreductionism without an overarching theory of ultimate behavioral causation, and our non-scientific descriptions of consciousness, a fresh approach is required. And that's what I hope to outline in my talk today. First, remember that no matter how puzzling consciousness appears to be, it happens in biological organisms, humans. And thus the solution requires an approach that draws upon the natural sciences of evolutionary biology, behavioral psychology, and neuroscience, in that order. The title of this conference contains the two muddiest terms in psychology, mind and consciousness. No offense, Michael. It's important to understand how we use a term before we attempt a scientific analysis of the behaviors that the term denotes. That analysis then needs to derive from experimentally established principles and not philosophical speculation. I'll make the simple but probably contentious point that what we speak of as consciousness is only behavior. There are no ghosts in the machine. Before turning my attention to consciousness, however, I'd like to comment briefly on the terms brain and mind, also in the conference title. First, brain. There's no question that in one sense the brain causes everything we do. But that raises the bigger and more ultimate question about behavioral causation. What causes the brain to cause behavior? In light of that question, let me repeat that we will not completely understand consciousness or any behavioral phenomenon, no matter how much we learn about the brain. And we won't completely understand the brain's role, without a cogent theory of behavioral causation. We must understand not just how the brain is structured or what part of the brain correlates with some activity, but why the brain is constructed the way it is and how it came to be that way. To answer those questions, we must turn to evolutionary biology to understand the evolutionary history of the species, and more importantly, in my view, to behavioral psychology to understand the individual's learning history. We must bring learning science into the picture if we are ever to make real headway in our understanding of the complex human behaviors made possible by the brain. Now to the word mind. In the upcoming article in Skeptic that Michael mentioned, titled How the Human Got Its Mind, Debunking the Last Great Myth in Psychology, I argue that mind, like consciousness, is just a word without a physical referent. As with other terms in the history of science, for example, ether, phlogiston, language acquisition device, that have been made up to explain the unexplainable, we invented the word mind to explain our own behavior. Unfortunately, along the way, we reified it. The mind was said to explain everything we did, and it could do so safely from its eternal hiding place, where it could also assume any qualities we wanted to give it. And just as with consciousness, literary descriptions of the mind abound. For example, the noted anthropologist Richard Leakey wrote that the mind is a channel for reaching worlds beyond the material objects of everyday life through imagination, and it offers us a means of bringing abstract worlds into technicolor reality, unquote. Beautiful. In my article, I argue that no other natural science still adheres to such antiquated, unscientific concepts that are relics from centuries of religious and philosophical speculation. I conclude that there is no mind other than the word, and that the behaviors we've tried in vain to explain by appealing to it can be understood more simply with experimentally established principles. In fact, I'd urge you to undertake an exercise. It's a little late in the day since you've heard most of the talks. See if you can avoid using the terms mind, mental structures, cognitive processes, or even consciousness, if you dare. If you do, you'll find the only things you are talking about are the observed events that science deals with, namely behavior and the physical events that cause it. Such an exercise will force you to be much more conservative and parsimonious in your thinking, and will lead to a more effective scientific analysis of the problems at hand. Because consciousness is not a thing, we need to understand what we mean when we use the word. In other words, we need to analyze the function of the term. Once we do that, we'll be able to show what behaviors are involved so that we can study their evolutionary and learning histories as well as their neural correlates. The result will demystify consciousness, always a risky venture and a threat to those who like their mysteries intact. To begin, let's ask what consciousness is. In my question, the word consciousness is in quotation marks, which means I'm asking what we mean when we use the word, or more precisely and scientifically, what variables cause us to utter the word. By doing so, we can avoid the reification error because consciousness is, after all, only a word. In answering the question, Julian Jaynes, in his unusual and controversial book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, began by asking what consciousness is not. His answer, consciousness is not involved in much of what we call perception. It's not involved in performing many skills, for example, playing the piano or playing basketball, and in fact can interfere with their execution. It's not necessary when speaking, writing, listening, and reading, or for much of what we call thinking and learning. Jaynes concludes that consciousness has no location except an imaginary one. For example, If you say that I'm conscious of the microphone, you don't mean that I adjust it or talk into it. That would be perception. Or that I'm conscious of playing the guitar just because I can play fluently, a skill. Or that a child learning to read is conscious, reading and learning. When you drove to the conference today on the freeways and couldn't remember one thing that happened along the way, then for our purposes, you weren't conscious of the drive, even though you perceived many things, executed numerous complex skills, and also read signs. Now, unless you were abducted by aliens at the beginning of your trip and plopped back down in your car just as you arrived, which is an experience I believe Michael can relate to, then what we want to know is this. If you weren't conscious of the drive, the other drivers, etc., then what exactly were you doing? Well, I'll tell you. You were talking and maybe imagining to yourself about something other than the stimuli related to driving the car. If you were a presenter, perhaps you were rehearsing your talk. This is what James, and I think most of us, mean by being conscious, or the conscious inner life. I've already stated that we won't find the snark we call consciousness in the recesses of a non-existent mind or in the neural architecture of the brain. We must therefore operationalize the term so we can generate an accurate description of the behaviors involved. Rather than speculating endlessly about vague, unobserved mental constructs, a behavioral approach looks not only to the behaviors and current environmental events that cause us to say that someone is conscious, but more importantly to the individual's learning history that establishes those relationships in the first place. It turns out that the answers are elegant and demonstrate how, as Chalmers puts it, an understanding of consciousness fits easily into the natural order. To know how we most often use the term consciousness, that is, its function, we need to ask three relatively simple questions. First, what is someone doing, what exactly is someone doing or saying when she is described as being conscious? Second, what are the circumstances that precipitate those behaviors? And perhaps most important, what are the past or present consequences for the behaviors that occur under those circumstances? In other words, how do we learn the particular behaviors that we describe as consciousness? This is the most important question because the answer will provide an ultimate explanation of how and why we become conscious, and it will supply neuroscientists with the roadmap they need to carry out their search for the neural correlates. As I've already intimated, the answer to the first question, what exactly is someone doing or saying when she is described as being conscious, is that she's talking or signing or writing about both her external and internal environments and her own public and private behavior. Daniel Dennett recently came around more fully to this position when he wrote that acquiring a human language, an oral or sign language, is a necessary precondition for consciousness. To paraphrase Descartes, I talk to myself, therefore I know I exist. And Helen Keller knew the importance of learning to describe oneself when she wrote that, before my teacher came to me, I did not know that I am. I lived in a world that was no world. I cannot hope to describe adequately that unconscious yet conscious time of nothingness. Since I had no power of thought, I did not compare one mental state with another. She seems to have understood implicitly what behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner said, that being conscious is reacting to one's own behavior verbally, and thus, ironically, is a social product taught to us by others. The problem becomes even thornier when our self-talk recedes to the covert or private level, creating much of the so-called conscious inner life that intrigues many. With this operational definition of consciousness, I'd like to turn to a more detailed answer to the second and third questions. What are the circumstances that provoke our self-talk, and how do we become conscious? Let me begin with an example of how a child learns to become conscious of her environment, followed by examples of how she learns to become conscious of her public behavior and her private events, that is, the stimuli and behavior within her own skin. Becoming self-aware begins simply enough with being taught how to label objects. Language learning children are taught to label everything through a process called discrimination learning. The parent points to a dog and asks, "What's that?" Before the child knows the answer, the parent models it by saying, "Doggy," or "That's a doggy. Can you say doggy?" If the child imitates, she can say, "Doggy." Of course, she doesn't yet know it's a dog. She's simply imitating. But after several trials, especially interspersed with trials regarding other objects such as books, cups, balls, the child can quickly say doggy when the parent points to the dog and poses the question. Later, simply the sight of the dog is sufficient to get the child to say doggy. In teaching this, the attentive parent reinforces the child's correct response by repeating, "Yes, that's a doggy." This is how the child comes to know her environment in the sense that she can talk about it. Progressing from simple names to saying more about things increases the child's consciousness of her environment. For example, being able to say only doggy in the presence of a dog reflects little consciousness compared with being able to say, "It's a small brown dachshund with a long tail and a loud bark that always runs around." But single labels are acquired first, and contrary to claims by some that parents don't teach their children language, I'll let you guess who the some are, There is considerable scientific evidence that this linguistic competence is indeed learned from parents and others in the verbal community. We can very successfully teach our children to describe and hence be conscious of their external environment because we can check their answers for accuracy. If we ask what color a red object is and the child says blue, we can see that it's wrong and correct the answer. Thus, the reliability of teaching awareness of the external environment is exceptionally high. Parents then begin asking their children other questions, such as, what are you doing? In the beginning, before the child knows the answer, the parent must provide it, just as the parent did when teaching about the environment. And because the parent can see what the child is doing, the answer is always correct. So when a child is banging a cup on the table and the parent asks, what are you doing? Are you banging the cup? And the child imitatively answers, banging cup. The parent reinforces the response by saying, right, you're banging the cup, and please stop. Of course, once this response is learned, the next time the parent asks the child, what are you doing? The child will likely say, well, either nothing or banging the cup. Whether or not the child is banging the cup. This is a principle of stimulus generalization, and it's found in all instances of learning, but particularly conspicuous when language learning. Clearly, we would not yet say the child is conscious that she's banging the cup, but she's on her way. After considerable experience with the parents discriminating different actions by the child and teaching the child how to describe them, we can now say that the child has at least the beginnings of self-awareness in the sense that she can describe what she's doing. The more words she can use to describe her actions, the greater we say her self-awareness is. When we say that someone is totally unaware of her actions, what we usually mean is that she cannot describe, either to herself or others, what she does. Sometimes we go to therapy so that therapists can help us become conscious of our own actions. A therapist does this like the parent of a language learning child, by observing our behavior and teaching us to make the same observations, and then how to talk more accurately about them. Once we can do that and say the same things to ourselves, we are said to have increased our awareness, or to have become more self-conscious of our actions. So far, so good. We're still in the observable world where we can operate objectively. But then, to paraphrase a favorite novel of mine by Joseph Heller, something happens. Parents don't stop with teaching children to describe their publicly observable behavior. They try to teach their children to describe their private world. They use the same methods, but without the same level of success. Consider how a parent might teach a child to say, my tummy hurts. The pain in the stomach is a stimulus generated by illness or injury. But unlike the child banging the cup, the parent doesn't have access to the child's pain. So how does the parent teach the child to say it hurts? The parent must rely on other sources of information. There are at least two ways that others can teach someone to label or describe a private stimulus. First, the verbal community can look for some public event that reliably accompanies the private one. In the case of a stomach ache, there isn't much to go on, save maybe for a distended stomach or vomiting. In the case of learning to say that a cut or a bruise hurts, the site of the cut or the bruise is the publicly accompanying event. A second way others can teach us about our own private events is to look for additional or corresponding responses. In the case of a stomach ache, the child may hold her stomach or rub it or vomit. Based upon these corresponding responses generated by the same painful stimuli, the parent teaches the child to report that my tummy hurts. The same process occurs when we're taught to describe our overt and covert behavior and private stimuli with such expressions as, I'm depressed, I'm scared, I'm anxious, or I'm sad. Even then, others need more information to teach the correct description. For example, simply observing someone crying gives us little to go on to accurately teach him to describe how he's feeling. Is he sad, hurt, or extremely happy? In such cases, we need to observe the precipitating environmental conditions or context. Nevertheless, all we can rely on to teach self-awareness is observable behavior, publicly accompanying events, corresponding responses, and the stimulating environment. There is no direct access to someone else's private world. It's no wonder, then, that when asked how we feel, we often don't know or can't put it into words. In addition to learning to respond verbally to private stimuli, something else happens which complicates the problem in manifold ways. Our overt public descriptions, verbal descriptions, recede to the covert or private level that only we can observe. How does this happen? As parents can attest, once language learning children learn a lot of names, they go around labeling everything out loud. Look, Daddy, car, doggy, man, ball. Convinced that we've done our job of teaching the correct names of things, we urge our children to say it to yourself quietly, reinforcing quieter and quieter talking, or ignoring or mildly discouraging louder outbursts. The result isn't magic, but as far as many are concerned, it may as well be. What happens is that the child's verbal behavior continues, but at a level unobserved by others. The child still says, car, doggy, man, ball, but to herself. Call it thinking or cognitive if you want, but except for its observability, the behavior is the same. And neurological evidence shows the same areas of the brain are active while speaking out loud as when speaking to oneself. Covert self-talk, or thinking, if you will, involves the same behaviors and brain areas as when the behaviors are public, thus preserving the continuity of behavior and obviating the need to invent what I call cognitive ghosts. Although I briefly commented on the brain earlier, I'd like to revisit the topic in light of the preceding analysis. If by consciousness we mean talking, either overtly or covertly, about the environment, our own overt and covert behavior, and the stimuli that cause it, then we already know a lot about the brain's role in accomplishing it. As psychologists Neil Carlson and William Buskus note, the physiological basis of consciousness is the activity of language mechanisms in the brain. Although the actual verbal descriptions are learned according to fairly well understood principles, the learning changes the brain, which then mediates between the stimulating environment and the verbal behavior of the conscious person. Evidence of consciousness as a verbal description of the environment in general and of our own behavior in particular comes from numerous examples of brain damage and from the so-called split brain studies. One example mentioned earlier is anterograde amnesia. Patients with this disorder, which usually involves damage to the hippocampus, can learn new behaviors but cannot talk about what they've learned. They can also remember, that is, talk about things they learned before the brain damage. In the parlance of memory researchers, we can say that the damage has disrupted their explicit remembering, or verbal descriptions, while leaving their implicit remembering, or nonverbal skills, intact. Following from the present thesis, people with anterograde amnesia are thus conscious only of what they knew before the brain damage, and of course, of ongoing events in their lives. In another disorder resulting from brain damage called visual agnosia, individuals cannot recognize objects by sight. By recognize, we mean the patients cannot say the name of the object when seeing it. In a more specific form called prosopagnosia, or face blindness, a person cannot recognize certain faces by sight. Again, by recognize, we mean the patient cannot say the person's name when seeing her face. In other words, the patient is not conscious of who the person is. Interestingly, the patient can say the person's name when hearing her voice and is thus conscious of the person. Because patients with visual agnosia are not blind, have no difficulty navigating visually through their environment, and can actually mime the behaviors related to objects shown to them, we can describe their disorder as a disconnection between perception and awareness. The final example represents one of the more interesting phenomena related to consciousness, the split brain studies. As many of you know, in some severe cases of epilepsy, the corpus callosum, the wide band of axons that join the two hemispheres of the brain, is severed to prevent the seizure from spreading to the opposite hemisphere. Although the surgery successfully controls the spread of seizures, researchers discovered a fascinating phenomenon. For example, if a spoon is briefly presented to the left visual field of split brain patients, they cannot say what they'd seen, but they can pick out the spoon when asked to feel an assortment of objects with their right hand. But if the spoon is briefly presented to the patient's right visual field, the patient can say spoon. Thus, the patients are conscious of the spoon only when there are neural connections between the visual system and the primary language areas of the brain, thus enabling them to call it a spoon. If by consciousness we mean a person can talk about her external and internal environments and overt and covert behavior, then neuroscientists already have a good understanding of its neural correlates because they know much about the cortical and subcortical regions of the brain that combine to produce language. Thus, we don't need to debate ad infinitum what consciousness is or where it's located, or try, like phrenologists, to look for the seat of consciousness in the brain. You can tell this is my last topic. It's at the end of the slide. So what is this so-called conscious inner life that we find so mysterious and elusive? Behavioral psychologists believe that the only things inside us are anatomical and physiological structures, including sensory receptors for pain, temperature, pressure, and proprioception. The primary difference between these interoceptive receptors and the exteroceptive ones in the eyes, ears, and on the surface of the skin is their location. Thus, if we can discover the role of public stimuli on behavior, then because private stimuli differ only in their location, not in their type, we can parsimoniously assume they have the same functions. If we learn, for example, to describe painful stimulation on the surface of the skin, then we can learn to describe painful stimulation inside the body. This is indeed an inner life, but not the one that so mystifies and intrigues many. In addition, as I've already stated, any behavior may recede to a covert or private level. For example, the pianist may covertly practice finger placements, the golfer covert golf swings or hand placements on the club, and of course, the fluent ASL user covert signing. Behavior, as caused proximately by the firing of neurons in the motor cortex, exists on a continuum of intensity. If I start screaming, I can gradually reduce the intensity of my vocal output to normal talking, and then whispering, until I'm the only one who can hear me. I'm behaving privately, covertly, but behaving nonetheless. However, the behavior is not taking place in my mind or in my consciousness because there are no such places. Just as evolutionary biologists assume a continuity of species, behavioral psychologists assume a continuity of behavior and the physical events that cause it. The good news is that such an assumption is parsimonious and can suggest an elegant solution to the problem of the nature and origin of consciousness. The bad news is that many people won't find the analysis as sexy and mysterious as speculating about consciousness, neurons, or qualia. One reason is simply because they're not familiar with the science behind behavioral theory. It's a complicated, sophisticated, and still growing experimental science. Those of you who believe behaviorism is dead, it is not dead. It is small, but it is not dead. It's very active. And hopefully I'm at least one individual representative of that. A more important reason that people won't find the analysis very, very sexy is because we've all been reared in a culture where ordinary common sense terms have been used to describe and explain human behavior for millennia. We simply cannot imagine that we don't have minds or free will or that our inner life isn't anything more than private stimuli and learned or unlearned covert behavior. My account of conscious experience may or may not be correct, but it's parsimonious because it appeals to observed relationships and experimentally established principles. We skeptics find it all too easy to find fault with obvious pseudosciences, but when it comes to our own messy, unscientific thinking, we are a lot less critical. It will take much longer to realize that consciousness may be nothing more than a learned repertoire of verbal behavior than it did to realize that the Earth is not flat, that it's not the center of the universe, and that life on Earth wasn't designed by a creator. Thank you very much for your attention.